The morning Nelson Blackwell rode into Harlan Creek with $20 burning a hole in his vest pocket and a deal he already half regretted. The sun was barely cresting the red mesa to the east, painting everything the color of an old wound. He was not what most people would call a dishonest man. He had never robbed a stage, never cheated at cards in a town where he planned to stay, and he had only lied to a woman once before. And that woman had been his mother, God rest her, when he told her the harvest would come good the year the drought took everything. So taking money to court a woman he had never met sat uneasily in his gut, the way bad beef sits uneasily, making itself known a little more with each passing hour. The arrangement had come to him through a man named Garrett Finch, who was neither a friend nor an enemy but fell somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground between the two. Garrett ran a saloon in the neighboring town of Creosote Flats, which was 40 miles south of Harlan Creek and a meaner place by most accounts. Garrett had a cousin in Harlan Creek, a cattle rancher named Douglas Bishop, and Douglas Bishop had a problem. The problem was named Alma. Not in the way a man might have a problem with a difficult horse or a disputed fence line. The problem, as Garrett had explained it over 2 glasses of rye whiskey in the amber-lit back room of his saloon, was that Alma Bishop was 26 years old, headstrong as a spring creek, sharp as a skinning knife, and utterly uninterested in the parade of men her uncle had been pushing in her direction since the death of her father 3 years prior. Douglas Bishop had control of the Bishop Ranch only so long as Alma remained unmarried, or until she chose to exercise her legal right to claim the property her father had left her. He had been managing her inheritance, which was a polite way of saying he had been spending it. He needed her married off to a man of his choosing, a man who would stay out of the ledgers and leave the ranch management comfortably in Douglas's hands before she turned 27 and was granted full legal authority over her own estate under the terms of her father's will. The plan was elegant in its dishonesty. Nelson would ride into Harlan Creek, present himself as a drifting cowhand looking for seasonal work, catch Alma Bishop's attention, court her gently but persistently, and in doing so make her feel that love had found her naturally, so that when Douglas introduced his chosen candidate, a land-hungry banker's son named Prescott, Alma would already be softened by the idea of romance, and more likely to accept a formal arrangement. Nelson was not supposed to let it go anywhere real. He was just supposed to warm the ground, $20 up front, 20 more when Alma and Prescott Webb were formally engaged. He had taken the first 20. He was already regretting it before his horse, a steady roan gelding named Cutter, had carried him 3 miles toward Harlan Creek. The town itself was the kind of place that had been planted with ambition and grown into something quieter and more complicated. There was a main street of packed earth flanked by a general store, a telegraph office, a land registry, a blacksmith, a modest church with a bell that had a crack in it, a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Prout, and a saloon called the Copper Spur that did reasonable business 6 nights a week and very good business on Saturday. Beyond the town, the land opened up into grazing flats broken by gullies and arroyos, and the Bishop Ranch sat on the best piece of that land, a spread of some 400 acres with a creek running through the lower pasture and a herd of close to 200 cattle. Nelson tied Cutter at the rail outside the general store and took a moment to settle himself. He was 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who had spent most of their lives outdoors became weathered, with dark hair worn a little long under his hat and gray eyes that people sometimes found unnerving because they looked like they were thinking even when the rest of his face was perfectly still. He had worked cattle from Texas to Montana. He had survived a bad winter in the Dakotas, a range dispute in New Mexico that had turned uglier than anyone had anticipated, and the kind of loneliness that a man accumulates when he spends too many years moving from one place to the next. He was not soft, but he had not become hard either, which was perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about him. He went into the general store to buy tobacco he did not especially need, because buying something gave a man a reason to be somewhere, and the woman behind the counter was exactly the kind of person who knew everything about everyone in a town of this size. The woman behind the counter was not Alma Bishop. She was a stout, cheerful woman of about 50 named Edna Greer, who sold him the tobacco, told him without much prompting that the boarding house had 2 rooms available, that the Bishop Ranch was hiring for fall roundup if he was looking for work, and that the new Methodist minister was expected next Thursday. She said all of this in the time it took her to count his change. Nelson thanked her and asked, as casually as he could manage, what the Bishop Ranch was like. Edna Greer's expression shifted into something more complicated. "Douglas Bishop runs it now," she said. "Since his brother passed, fine enough cattle operation. You'll want to talk to the foreman, man named Hollies, about work." She paused. "Douglas's niece, Alma, she's the one who really knows that land. Her father, Robert Bishop, he built that place from nothing. Alma grew up working it right alongside him. She'll probably be at the ranch when you go out to ask about work. Don't let her put you off. She's particular." "Particular," Nelson repeated. "She knows what she wants," Edna said, with a tone that suggested this was both an admirable and slightly inconvenient quality. He rode out to the Bishop Ranch that afternoon. The house was large by frontier standards, a 2-story structure of pale timber that had weathered to silver gray, with a wide covered porch and flower beds that someone had clearly put real care into, even though it was late in the season and most of the blooms were past. There were 2 horses in the near corral and smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. A man came out of the barn before Nelson had finished tying Cutter. He was broad and deliberate in his movements, somewhere in his 50s, with a sun-creased face and the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of working outdoors. This was Hollies, the foreman, and he listened to Nelson's inquiry about seasonal work with the focused attention of a man who had heard every possible version of a cowhand's pitch and could sort the reliable ones from the trouble in about 2 minutes. "You handle cattle in rough country?" Hollies asked. "Yes," Nelson said. "You drink so much it interferes with the work." "No. You start fights." "I finish them, I don't start them." Hollies studied him for another moment, then nodded. "Roundup starts in 10 days. Pay is $1.50 a day and meals. Bunkhouse has room. You can start tomorrow helping with fence repair in the south pasture if you want to show me what you're worth before the real work begins." Nelson said that suited him fine. It was as he was turning to go that the screen door of the house opened, and Alma Bishop came out onto the porch. He understood immediately why Edna Greer had used the word particular. It was not the right word exactly, but it was the word a woman like Edna would reach for when what she really meant was that Alma Bishop did not dim herself to make other people more comfortable. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way of the women in illustrated magazines. She was striking in a more elemental way, the way a weather-changed landscape is striking, something shaped by real forces into something honest and strong. She was tall for a woman, with dark copper-brown hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat she wore slightly tilted, and brown eyes that were sharp and warm at the same time, which Nelson would come to understand was exactly who she was. She wore a plain working dress with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and boots that had seen real use. She looked like she had been doing something useful, and had paused only momentarily to see what was happening in her yard. She looked at Nelson with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had grown up understanding that land and livestock and people all needed to be read quickly and accurately. "Hollies," she said, "is this man our new fence hand?" "Yes, Miss Bishop," Hollies said. She looked at Nelson for another moment. "You know how to set a post properly?" she asked him. "I do," he said. "Good," she said, "because the south pasture fence is an embarrassment, and if another cow goes through it I'm going to be deeply annoyed." She turned and went back inside. Nelson stood in the yard feeling something odd and specific that he could not immediately name. He told himself it was just the novelty of the situation. He was wrong about that. The first 3 days, he worked fence in the south pasture with a taciturn young man named Pete, who communicated primarily through grunts and occasional pointed silences. The work was hard and good in the way that honest physical labor is good. It occupied the body completely and left the mind just free enough to think without becoming trapped in its own loops. Nelson was strong and efficient, and Hollis watched him with increasing satisfaction, which Nelson recognized but did not particularly seek. He thought about the arrangement with Garrett Finch and Douglas Bishop approximately 40 times a day during those first 3 days. He had not seen Douglas Bishop yet. He had glimpsed the man once, riding out from the ranch house in the early morning, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with an expensive hat and the manner of someone accustomed to having things arranged for his convenience. He did not stop to speak to the fence crew. Alma Bishop, on the other hand, was everywhere. She moved through the ranch with the ease and authority of someone who had grown up there and knew every inch of it. She checked the cattle in the east pasture each morning. She spent time with the horses in a way that was clearly more than functional. She talked to them, which Nelson found unexpectedly charming. She argued good-naturedly with Hollis about the schedule for moving the herd to the winter grazing and won the argument through the combination of detailed knowledge and sheer persistence that Nelson was beginning to recognize as characteristic. She did not seek him out. She did not appear to think about him at all, which was, he acknowledged to himself, entirely appropriate. He was a fence hand who had been on the property for 3 days. There was no reason she should think about him, but she noticed things. On the 3rd day, he was working alone near the gate that led into the north pasture, resetting a post that had heaved out of true during the previous winter, when he became aware that someone had come up behind him. He turned to find Alma Bishop standing 10 feet away, watching him work with an expression that was purely professional. She was looking at the fence, not at him. "You set that anchor differently than Hollis showed Pete," she said. "The Hollis method works in softer ground," Nelson said. "This soil has more clay in it. This way it won't heave as bad next winter." She was quiet for a moment. Then she crouched down and examined the base of the post herself, pressing her fingers into the packed earth around it. He watched her assess his work with complete seriousness and without any of the self-consciousness a person gets when they know they are being observed. "That's a better method," she said. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her fingers. "My father used to do it this way." "Where did you learn it?" "Montana," he said. "The ground up there is similar." She nodded. "You've been around." It was not a question, and it was not a criticism. It was simply an observation, delivered with a neutrality that told him she was making up her own mind about him and was not in a particular hurry about it. "Enough places," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those direct, warm eyes, then said, "When you're done here, there's a section on the west line that needs the same treatment. I'll show you where." And she did. She walked him to the west fence line herself and showed him the problem sections with precise and knowledgeable attention to detail, explaining why the ground settled differently there due to an underground seep that ran through the lower soil in spring. She talked about the land the way some people talk about people they love, with affection and full attention, and the specific knowledge that comes from years of paying close attention. Nelson listened to her and felt the $20 in his vest pocket grow heavier with every sentence. That evening, he sat on the edge of his bunk in the ranch bunkhouse and wrote a short letter to Garrett Finch. He wrote, "I am here. The situation is complicated." He stared at those 2 sentences for a long time, then folded the letter and put it under his bedroll rather than sending it. The complication was not what he had expected. He had expected to find a lonely, easily flattered woman who could be maneuvered by the simple application of male attention. The women in Garrett's version of events were always like that, soft and sighing and easily managed, the way Garrett managed everything in his life, which was to say by finding the weakness and applying the appropriate pressure. Alma Bishop did not have that kind of weakness. She had other kinds. He could see that already, but they were not the kind that could be exploited by false flattery or manufactured romantic attention. She would see through that immediately, and the contempt that followed would be complete and permanent. Which meant that if he were going to do what he had been paid to do, he would have to be honest, or at least honest enough. This presented an obvious problem, which was that his entire purpose here was fundamentally dishonest. He did not sleep well that night. On the fourth day, a thing happened that changed everything. He was at the water trough near the barn, washing the afternoon's grit from his face and hands, when he heard raised voices from inside the ranch house. The windows were open in the warm September air, and the voices carried clearly Douglas Bishop's voice, which was the voice of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through volume and certainty, and Alma's voice, which was lower than Douglas's but somehow carried further because it had an edge to it like a well-maintained tool. Nelson did not intend to listen, but he did not move away either. "Prescott Webb is a man of standing," Douglas was saying. "His father holds paper on half the land in the county. An alliance with that family would be, I am not a piece of land to be used in an alliance," Alma said. "You are 26 years old and you are running out of time to what? To become someone's property. Because that is what you mean, isn't it, Douglas? Not that I am running out of time to be happy. Not that you are concerned about my future. You mean I am running out of time for you to arrange things before father's will gives me what is already mine." There was a silence. My father wanted me to have this ranch," Alma said, and her voice had gone very still in a way that was more frightening than volume. "He told me so. 17 times, I counted, in the last year of his life. He wanted me to have it and to run it because he knew I could. What he did not want was for you to spend 3 years running it into debt while you waited for some convenient marriage to solve your problem." Another silence. "I have seen the ledgers, Douglas. I have seen all of them, including the ones you keep in the drawer you thought was locked." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Nelson straightened up from the water trough. He felt cold in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the water. "That is a serious accusation," Douglas said at last, and his voice had changed. "It is a serious fact," Alma said. "And when I turn 27 in 11 months, it will become a legal matter. So I suggest you think very carefully about how you wish to spend those 11 months." He heard her footsteps crossing the floor, and then the screen door opened and she came out onto the porch. She did not see him at first. She stood at the porch rail with her hands gripping it and her face turned toward the western hills, where the sun was going down in a wash of amber and red, and for the first time since he had arrived, she looked tired. Not defeated, not Alma Bishop, but tired in the way a person gets when they have been fighting something for a long time, and the fighting is wearing on them even as the fighting goes on. Then she saw him. He expected her to be embarrassed at being caught in an unguarded moment. Instead, she looked at him with a kind of clear-eyed assessment, measuring how much he had heard and what he would do with it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wasn't trying to overhear." "But you did," she said, not accusing, just naming it. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she came down the porch steps and walked toward the barn, and he fell into step beside her without quite deciding to, and she did not tell him to go away. They walked in silence for a minute. The evening was cooling quickly the way it did at this elevation in September, and the sky was going from amber to indigo above the mesa. "My uncle," she said finally, "has been telling people in town that I am difficult, that I need managing." She said the word managing with a very particular flatness. "He has also, I believe, been setting things up, various schemes to push me toward a marriage that would be convenient for him." She glanced at him. "Are you one of those schemes?" The question hit him like a bucket of cold water. "Why would you ask me that?" He said, and the fact that he neither confirmed nor denied it told her something. He could see it in the way her eyes sharpened. "Because," she said slowly, "Holly's has been hiring fence hands for 11 years, and he has never once brought one to my attention." But the day you arrived, Douglas seemed not exactly pleased, but satisfied in a way I have learned to notice, like a man who has set a trap and come back in the morning to check it. She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Are you going to lie to me?" she asked. She said it the way she had said everything else, directly, without drama, as if the truth were simply the most efficient and useful thing between two people. Nelson Blackwell had not told a significant lie in his adult life and gotten away with it, because he had a face that worked poorly in the service of dishonesty. He was aware of this about himself. He had always considered it more of a feature than a flaw. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "Then tell me." So he told her. All of it Garrett Finch in the back room of the Creosote Flats saloon, the $20 up front, the plan to soften her toward the idea of romance so that she would be more receptive to Prescott Webb, the $20 more that he had not yet collected and now knew he never would. He told her with the uncomfortable and somewhat unmanly feeling of a person pulling out a splinter painful in the extraction, relieving once done. She listened without interrupting. Her face went through several things while he talked: anger, which she managed with visible effort, and then something colder and more thoughtful, and then something that surprised him, which was a kind of dark amusement. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Well," she said, "at least you are honest about being dishonest." "That's probably the most I deserve right now," he said. "It is," she agreed. She turned and looked out across the pasture where the cattle were moving in their slow evening drift toward the water. "How much did he pay you?" $20. She made a sound that might have been a laugh stripped of all its warmth. $20. "I'm worth $20 to my uncle." She shook her head. "Prescott Webb would get the cattle, the grazing rights, and my father's house, and Douglas gets to keep managing the money." She said it flatly, naming it the way she named everything. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She turned back to look at him. The last of the sunlight was on her face, and she looked in that moment absolutely certain of herself in a way that he found almost difficult to look at directly, the way you cannot look directly at the sun. "What I was already going to do," she said. "Protect what is mine." She paused. "The question is what you are going to do." He reached into his vest pocket, took out the $20, and held it toward her. "I think this belongs to your ranch fund more than it belongs in my pocket." She looked at the money for a moment, then she looked at his face. Then she took the money, folded it, and put it in her own pocket with a practicality that made him want to smile. "You'll stay and do the work you were hired for," she said. It was not quite a question. "If you'll have me," he said. "For the real wages, I'm a good fence hand. I'm a better cattle hand." "I know," she said. "I watched you work for 3 days before I asked you about the post." She held out her hand. It was a calloused, working hand, and he shook it, and something settled between them that was entirely different from what Douglas Bishop and Garrett Finch had intended. "One more thing," she said. "If Douglas asks, you are still courting me." He looked at her. "Beg your pardon." "It will buy me time," she said calmly. "If Douglas thinks his plan is working, he won't try another one immediately. Meanwhile, I have 11 months to get my affairs in order, and I intend to use every day of them." She tilted her head slightly. "I am told this sort of arrangement is called a strategic deception." "It is," he said, "among other things. Can you manage it, the pretending?" He thought about how he had felt watching her examine his fence post with complete serious attention. He thought about the way she talked about the land, and the way she had gripped the porch rail with tired hands. He thought about $20 and dishonest arrangements, and the difference between what a person was paid to do and what a person actually chose to do. "I can manage the pretending," he said, "for as long as you need it." What he did not say, and what he was already beginning to suspect with the quiet certainty of a man who reads weather and ground and the slow, reliable movements of things, was that the pretending was already becoming something else entirely, and it had barely been 4 days. The arrangement required them to be seen together in ways that would read as courtship to Douglas's watchful eye and to the inevitable gossip network of Harlan Creek, which was efficient as a telegraph. They rode together on Saturday afternoon under the pretense of checking the east fence line, genuinely checking the east fence line, because Alma did not waste time on purely theatrical gestures when something useful could be accomplished simultaneously. The ride took 2 hours. In those 2 hours, Nelson learned more about the Bishop Ranch and its land and its history than he had gathered in the previous 4 days, because Alma talked about it the way a person talks when they are with someone they have decided to trust, which is to say freely and specifically, and without performing. She told him about her father, Robert Bishop, who had come to that valley in 1871 with $40 and a wagon and a single-minded conviction that the land could sustain a cattle operation if you worked it honestly and did not take shortcuts. She told him about learning to ride at 4 years old, about the drought of 1878 that had taken a third of the herd, and how her father had rebuilt without bitterness, about her mother who had died when Alma was 9, and whom she still thought about when the lilac bushes in the yard bloomed in May because her mother had planted them. Nelson listened and asked questions and did not pretend to be more interested than he was, which was not necessary because he was genuinely interested. "You loved him very much," he said, meaning her father. It was not an especially remarkable thing to say, but he said it with enough simple accuracy that she glanced at him. "He was a good man," she said. "He didn't cheat anyone, didn't borrow against what he hadn't earned, didn't use people." A pause. "I spend a lot of time being angry that he's gone and Douglas is here instead. That's a natural thing to feel. Natural doesn't make it easier," she said. And then, a moment later in a different tone, "Tell me something about you." "Not the fence work, something real." He thought for a moment. He was not a man who talked about himself easily, not because he was hiding anything but because he had spent enough years in his own company that the skill of self-disclosure had grown a little rusty. "I grew up in East Texas," he said. "My father was a sharecropper. We didn't own anything, which meant we worked everything twice as hard for half the result. I left when I was 18 because I couldn't see what staying would give me that leaving wouldn't." He paused. "I've spent 12 years moving around, working cattle mostly, some carpentry in the winters. I'm good at the work, but I've never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home." She was looking at him. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Why not?" she asked. "Because you can't stay somewhere that isn't yours," he said, "and nothing has ever been mine." The silence that followed was a thoughtful one, not an uncomfortable one. "What would yours look like," she asked, "if you could choose?" He surprised himself with how quickly the answer formed, and with how specific it was: land that was his own, not borrowed or rented or worked for someone else's benefit. Something small but solid. Cattle, certainly. A place with good water and a view of something worth seeing every morning. "Something like this," he said, and gestured at the land around them with enough honesty that she heard it clearly. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "My father used to say that a person's relationship with land is like a marriage. You have to choose it properly and then you have to commit to it completely, or it never becomes what it could be." "He sounds like he was wise," Nelson said. "He was," she said simply. They rode back to the ranch house in the long golden light of the September afternoon, and when they came into the yard, Douglas Bishop was standing on the porch watching them with an expression of cautious satisfaction that Nelson recognized, and that made him feel simultaneously used and furious. He kept his face neutral and touched his hat brim to Douglas, who nodded back with the self-congratulatory warmth of a man who thinks his plan is unfolding. Alma went inside without looking at her uncle. Nelson went to the barn and stood beside Cutter for a while, talking to the horse the way he sometimes did when he needed to sort through something without the complication of being overheard. "I'm in trouble," he told Cutter. Cutter was philosophically inclined about these things. The following week brought Roundup, and Roundup brought with it the particular intensity that large-scale cattle work imposes on everyone involved: long days that began before first light, constant problem-solving, the physical exhaustion that is not unpleasant because it is earned, and the kind of focused community that forms among people doing hard, necessary work together. Nelson worked hard and well, and Hollies watched him with increasing respect. He had a natural understanding of cattle, not just the mechanics of handling them, but the deeper literacy of reading a herd's mood and anticipating problems before they became crises. He worked alongside two other permanent hands, a quiet Mexican man named Rafael, who was the best roper Nelson had ever seen, and an older cowhand named Dub, who had a story for every situation, and most of the stories were at least partially true. Alma worked the roundup too. This surprised some people, but not Nelson, who had already understood that she was not a woman who directed work from a distance. She rode as well as any of them and better than most, and she had an eye for the cattle that was as good as Nelson's, and sometimes better, because she knew every animal in that herd individually in the way that a rancher who has grown up with a herd knows them. There were moments during those long roundup days when the pretense of courtship fell away entirely, because they were simply working too hard to maintain any kind of social performance. And it was in those moments that something more genuine established itself, not through any deliberate action, but through the simple repeated experience of working alongside someone and discovering that you trust their judgment and that they trust yours. He pulled her horse back from a situation that would have resulted in a bad fall on the third day of roundup. Her mare had spooked at a rattlesnake in the dry creek bed and gone sideways, and Nelson was close enough to catch the bridle and hold the mare steady before Alma went down. She sat the recovered horse for a moment, steadied her breathing, and looked at him with an expression that was purely human and unguarded, the expression of someone who has just missed a bad thing and knows it. "Thank you," she said. "You'd have caught her yourself," he said, and she probably would have, but he was glad he had been there. That evening, after the day's work was done, and the hands were eating at the long table outside the bunkhouse, Alma brought him a cup of coffee and sat down beside him on the bench with the easy naturalness of someone who has decided not to think too carefully about appearances. They sat in the cooling evening with their coffee and watched the last light leave the sky and did not say much. And the not saying much had the comfortable texture of people who have spent enough time together that silence is no longer an awkward default, but a shared choice. Douglas watched from the porch of the ranch house with his satisfied expression. Nelson watched the stars come out over the mesa and thought about honesty. On the 6th day after he had told Alma the truth, he told her something else. They were at the west fence line again, this time actually repairing a section that the cattle had pushed through, and the work had found them side by side for most of the morning, and the conversation had moved from the practical to the personal in the gradual, unplanned way that conversations do when two people are comfortable and not performing. He told her about a woman he had been close to in New Mexico 5 years earlier, a woman named Clara who had been warm and good, and who had wanted him to stay and whom he had not stayed for, because he had not yet understood what he was doing when he kept moving, which was avoiding the vulnerability of committing to something that could be taken away. Alma listened. She was working while she listened, her hands busy with wire and pliers, but her attention was entirely on him in a way that he had come to recognize as characteristic. She gave things her full attention or she didn't give them any, and there was no in-between. "What happened to her?" she asked. "She married a good man in Las Cruces," he said. "She's got 3 children. I think she's happy." "And you?" "I moved on," he said, "the way I always did." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think about stopping?" she asked. "Moving, I mean. Do you think about finding a place?" "I do now," he said, and he said it simply and without particular emphasis. But she heard it, and he knew she heard it because she did not look at him immediately. She kept her eyes on the fence wire, and there was a quality to her stillness that told him the words had landed somewhere real. That evening, Douglas Bishop called Nelson into the ranch house parlor and offered him a drink and talked to him in the manner of a man who believes he is managing a situation skillfully while actually displaying all of his anxiety through overconfidence. "The girl is warming to you," Douglas said, in a tone that made Nelson's hands want to close into fists. He kept them open. "She's a good woman," Nelson said. "She is," Douglas agreed, with the warmth of someone who did not mean it. "She'll need a firm hand. Not in an unkind way. She just needs direction, someone to guide her. She's been given too much independence is the trouble. He poured another drink. Prescott Webb is coming to town next month. I'd like her in a receptive frame of mind before then. I understand, Nelson said, which was true, though not in the way Douglas meant it. Good man, Douglas said, and clapped him on the shoulder with the heartiness of someone who has never in his life doubted that other people were instruments available for his use. Nelson walked out of that parlor with a clarity he had not had before. It settled into him as he walked back to the bunkhouse, cool and final, like water finding its level. He went looking for Alma. He found her in the barn, as he had half expected, in the stall of her mare, doing nothing more complicated than leaning against the horse with her arm around the animal's neck, which was, he understood by now, one of the things she did when she needed to think without interruption. "Your uncle just told me Prescott Webb is coming next month," he said. "I know," she said. She did not move from her position against the horse. "I intercepted a letter last week." Of course she had. He leaned against the barn wall and looked at her. In the lantern light her face was all warm shadows and determined lines. "Alma," he said. "Nelson," she said back, and there was something in the way she said his name that was new, not the name of a useful co-conspirator, but the name of someone specific. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me." The pretending stopped, he said. "Whatever it was we agreed to do for Douglas's benefit, it stopped. For me, some time ago now." He paused. "I want you to know that because you deserve to know what's real and what isn't, and I am done letting you not know." She was very still for a moment. Her hand moved slowly along the mare's neck. "How long ago?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Before the first week was out," he said. She turned to look at him then. The lantern light made her eyes very dark and very clear at the same time. "I've been trying," she said slowly, "to decide whether what I feel is gratitude or trust or something else. I've been telling myself it's gratitude or trust, that it made sense to feel warmly towards someone who told me the truth when he didn't have to. And," he said, "and I am not as good at lying to myself as I used to be," she said. She came out of the stall, and the mare put her head over the stall gate, and watched them with the equine interest of an animal that has been present for important conversations before. They stood in the middle of the barn with the lantern between them and the smell of hay and horses and the warm animal dark around them, and Nelson thought about how completely his life had rearranged itself in less than 2 weeks, and how little he wanted to rearrange it back. "I'm not Prescott Webb," he said. "I don't have land or money or family connections. I have a horse and the wages from this job and 12 years of experience working other people's cattle." "I know exactly what you have," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything you don't have." "What are you asking for?" he said. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were calloused and warm, and they curled around his with the same directness she brought to everything. "To stop pretending," she said. "Both of us." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of her knuckles, which was an impulse he had been managing for days and that he was finished managing, and she let him. And the barn was very quiet except for the soft movements of the horses and the distant sound of the night wind coming in off the mesa. The next morning everything was different and nothing was different, which is exactly how it is when something real begins. They were careful, in the way of people who understand that timing matters, and that what is growing between them is worth protecting from the various pressures that could damage it prematurely. Douglas continued to see what he wanted to see, a courtship progressing according to his plan, and Nelson continued to perform the external gestures of a man pursuing a woman, the Saturday rides and the public conversations and the escort to and from church. But the substance behind those gestures was now entirely real and entirely his own, and Alma felt the difference, and he knew she felt it. They talked during those rides about everything. About the ranch and what it would take to make it fully profitable again once Alma had control of the ledgers. About the legal situation and what Alma had learned from a lawyer in the county seat, which was that her father's will was airtight, and that when she turned 27, the property transfer would be automatic and Douglas's management authority would end completely. About the debt Douglas had accumulated against the ranch and how it might be addressed. About Nelson's past and Alma's past and the things they had each lost and the things they still wanted. One Sunday, riding back from church through the afternoon light, Alma said, "I have been thinking about what you said. About nothing ever being yours." "What about it?" he said. "Do you think that changes?" she asked. "Or does it just stay, that feeling?" He considered it seriously, the way she always considered things, not performing consideration but actually doing it. "I think it changes," he said. "I think it changes when you find the right thing and the right person and you stop moving." "Have you stopped moving?" she asked. "I don't have any particular desire to go anywhere," he said carefully. She looked at him sidelong with that warm, sharp gaze. "That is a very cautious answer." "I am trying," he said, "not to assume things that haven't been offered." "Nelson," she said patiently, "I am holding your hand. We are riding back from church together. I told you 2 days ago that I have strong feelings for you. What exactly would constitute an offer in your estimation?" He laughed genuinely, which startled a bird out of the brush beside the road. "A fair point," he said. "A very fair point," she agreed. Then more quietly, "I don't want you to go anywhere. I want you to stay." She paused. "I know it's early. I know we've known each other less than a month. But I don't think the length of time is the measure of the thing." "Neither do I," he said. "My father knew he wanted to marry my mother within 2 weeks of meeting her," she said. "He told me that once. He said he knew because the thought of leaving without her was unbearable. He said the thought of her not being in his life felt like losing something essential, like losing water or light." Nelson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a very accurate description of something I have been feeling." She looked at him with an expression that was both soft and amused. "Is it?" "It is," he said, and meant it completely. She squeezed his hand, and they rode home through the golden light, and the conversation did not need to continue, because it had said everything essential. Prescott Webb arrived in Harlan Creek on the 3rd week of October, on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of coming rain. He was exactly what Nelson had expected from a banker's son, who had grown up comfortable, well-dressed, well-fed, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from having been told all your life that your desires are naturally reasonable. He was perhaps 30 years old, with light hair and a smooth handshake, and the kind of practiced charm that looks, from a distance, like genuine warmth but reveals itself at close range as a performance. Douglas introduced him to Alma at dinner that evening with the air of a man presenting a particularly good solution to a problem. Alma was polite, direct, and entirely unmoved. She asked Prescott Webb intelligent questions about banking and land acquisition that he struggled to answer in ways that revealed his actual understanding of either, and she watched his discomfort with the patient neutrality of a person waiting to see what a situation will show them. Nelson was not at the dinner. He was a ranch hand. He ate in the bunkhouse. He sat at the long table with Raphael and Dub and Pete and ate his supper and tried not to think about what was happening in the ranch house and mostly failed. "You're doing that thing with your fork," Dub observed. "What thing?" "The stabbing thing," Dub said. "Like the beans offended you personally." Raphael said nothing, but his eyes moved from Nelson to the ranch house and back with a mild eloquence. "I'm fine," Nelson said. "Sure you are," said Dub. The following morning Alma came to find him where he was working in the near pasture, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee, and her expression was the controlled, irritated expression of someone who has spent an evening being managed. "How was dinner?" he asked. "Informative," she said, and handed him a cup. Prescott Webb is exactly what you would expect from someone who has spent 30 years being told he is exceptional without doing anything exceptional. He talked about himself for 3 hours. She paused. "He also told me, during a private moment when Douglas stepped out, that he had been told I was eager to settle down, and that he hoped we could come to an arrangement quickly, because he had other property matters to attend to back in the county seat." She said this with a flatness that communicated precisely how she felt about being described as an eager woman with matters to arrange. Nelson drank his coffee and looked at the hills. "What did you say?" "I told him that I made arrangements at my own pace and on my own terms," she said, "and that anyone who found that inconvenient was welcome to attend to their property matters at their earliest convenience." "How did he take that?" "He smiled," she said, "in the way of a man who believes that firm women simply need more time." She shook her head, and Douglas looked like he had swallowed something sour. "What do you want to do?" Nelson asked. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I want to resolve this properly," she said. "I have been in contact with Mr. Ames. He is the attorney in Beechwood who handled my father's estate. He has been doing some investigation on my behalf regarding the ranch accounts. The numbers Douglas has provided do not match the numbers that Mr. Ames has been able to verify through the bank records, which are public documents." She paused. "There is enough there for a legal challenge, not just to Douglas's management, but to some of the arrangements he has made with other parties, including, I believe, the payments he has made to Garrett Finch and to you." Nelson lowered his cup. "He told Ames about those payments." "He did not," she said, with a slight smile that had no humor in it. "I told Mr. Ames about them. You told me, which means I know, and knowing is enough to begin with." He looked at her for a long moment. "Alma," he said, "you have been planning this carefully for some time." "I have been planning this since the week after my father's funeral," she said quietly, "when I first looked at the books and understood what Douglas intended." The humor left her expression entirely. 3 years, Nelson. I have been patient for 3 years because I had to be. Because I was 23 years old and a woman without legal authority, and the law was not built for me to use it easily. A pause, but I have been preparing. Every letter to Mr. Ames, every document I have preserved, every account I have quietly noted. She squared her shoulders. Prescott Webb's arrival just moved up my timeline. He had thought he understood what she was, but he had not yet understood the full depth of it. The patience it took to endure 3 years of Douglas's management, of his schemes and his condescension and his comfortable assumption that she could be arranged like furniture, while quietly and methodically building the legal case to undo all of it, that was not just determination. That was something closer to profound and disciplined courage. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, and then reconsidered. "Actually, can you write?" "Yes." "Will you write a statement of what Douglas paid you through Garrett Finch to do, and for what purpose, and what you understood the arrangement to be?" "Yes," he said immediately. She nodded. "That will be useful." She looked at him. "It will also, I want you to know, make things difficult for you. If Douglas pushes back and this becomes formal, your name will be connected to it." "I know," he said. "I'm not interested in protecting my name at the cost of the truth. I was part of a dishonest arrangement, even if only briefly, and even if I told you about it. The honest thing to do is say so plainly when it matters." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Something moved through her expression that was warmer and more vulnerable than her usual directness. "My father would have liked you," she said. And from Alma Bishop that was not a casual compliment but a substantial one, and both of them knew it. Nelson wrote the statement that evening, carefully and completely, setting down every detail of the arrangement with Garrett Finch, the amounts paid, the purpose outlined, and the date on which he had disclosed the arrangement to Alma. He wrote it in clean, plain language and signed it at the bottom and gave it to Alma, who folded it and placed it in a locked box she kept in her room. Prescott Webb stayed in town at the boarding house for a week, making calls at the ranch and taking dinners with Douglas, and progressively discovering that Alma was not softening toward him in any meaningful way. He was not a perceptive man in most respects, but he was a practical one. And by the end of the week, he had begun to look at Nelson with the assessing look of a man who is starting to understand that the territory he came to claim is already occupied. He attempted, on the second-to-last day of his visit, to have a private word with Nelson near the barn. "I'm told you've been keeping company with Miss Bishop," Prescott said. "I have," Nelson said. "I want to be clear," Prescott said, with the careful man-to-man tone of someone who believes in the straightforward negotiation of territory, "that this was not expected. When I was invited here, it was with the understanding that Miss Bishop was available." "She's always been available," Nelson said. "That word means free to make her own choices. She is. She's been making them." Prescott looked at him with a calculation that was almost admirable in its lack of subtlety. "Are your intentions toward her serious?" "Very," Nelson said. Prescott nodded slowly, and Nelson could see him doing the mathematics of the situation. Douglas Bishop's invitation weighed against what was actually in front of him, which was a woman who did not want him and a man who plainly did, and finding that the mathematics did not add up to anything useful for him. He left Harlan Creek the following morning. Douglas was in a cold fury for 3 days, which expressed itself as pointed silence during meals and a series of increasingly heavy nights at the Copper Spur Saloon, which the town noticed and discussed with the comprehensive interest of a community that does not miss much. He called Nelson into the parlor again on the 4th day. "You did not do what you were hired to do," Douglas said. His voice was controlled, but his hands were not, and they moved restlessly on the desk before him. "I did what I was hired to do by Hollies," Nelson said. "Fence work, cattle, the roundup, all of it well and completely. The other arrangement, the one through Garrett Finch, I ended that of my own accord." "You'll get nothing more from me," Douglas said. "I never expected anything from you," Nelson said. "And I didn't want it when you were offering." He paused. "Mr. Bishop, I think you should speak with a lawyer about your situation, a good one and soon. Not because I am threatening you, but because I believe you are about to have some unpleasant surprises and it would be better to be prepared." Douglas looked at him. His face went through a complicated series of expressions. "What do you know?" he said. "Enough," Nelson said. "More than is comfortable and probably less than Miss Bishop knows." Douglas was very quiet for a moment. "She's been building a case," he said finally, in the tone of a man arriving late at a conclusion. "She has," Nelson said. "She is her father's daughter. She does things thoroughly and she does them right." He stood up. "Talk to a lawyer, Mr. Bishop. Make this easier for everyone." He walked out of the parlor, and Douglas did not stop him. Mr. Ames came to Harlan Creek on a Wednesday in late October, a small, brisk man with a large briefcase and a manner of total professional focus that suggested he had seen every variety of family financial mismanagement, and was neither surprised nor particularly moved by any of it. He met with Alma for 3 hours in the front parlor while Douglas was conspicuously absent, and Nelson worked in the pasture and tried not to watch the house. When Ames left, Alma came to find Nelson. Her face was calm in a particular way, the calm of someone who has just been told something they already half knew, but needed to have confirmed officially. "It is as I thought," she said. "The debt Douglas created against the ranch is significant but not insurmountable. Mr. Ames believes that the manner in which it was created constitutes a breach of his fiduciary duty as a state manager, which means the debt structure can be legally challenged. Several of the arrangements he made can be unwound." She paused. "He will not go to prison. Ames does not believe the case rises to criminal fraud as opposed to civil mismanagement. But his authority over the ranch will end. His personal liability for the losses will be established, and the ranch will return to what it always should have been." "Yours," Nelson said. "Mine," she said, and the word was both simple and enormous. "Father's first, then mine." He could see what it cost her to hold herself still in this moment, the emotion she was managing with the same practical discipline she managed everything. He stepped forward and she let him put his arms around her, and she leaned into him with a long, slow exhale, like a person setting down a weight they have been carrying for a very long time. They stood like that for a while in the cooling afternoon, in the yard of the ranch that her father had built from nothing and that she had been fighting for, and the cattle moved in the distant pasture, and the wind came off the mesa, and Nelson thought, "Here. This is where I stop moving." Douglas Bishop did not make it easy or graceful. He spent 2 weeks in denial and 2 more in negotiation, and several evenings at the Copper Spur that people talked about for months afterward. But Mr. Ames was methodical, and the documentation was thorough, and in the end, Douglas signed the papers that restored full legal control of the Bishop Ranch to Alma, effective upon her 27th birthday in August of the following year, along with an agreement to personally address a portion of the debt he had created. He did not leave Harlan Creek immediately. He had nowhere particular to go, but he moved into the boarding house, and his presence at the ranch contracted to nothing over the following weeks. Garrett Finch sent Nelson an irritated letter from Creosote Flats demanding the return of the $20. Nelson wrote back that the $20 had been returned to its rightful owner. He did not elaborate. Garrett sent a second letter with more elaborate language. Nelson did not respond to the second letter. November came in cold and brilliant, the sky above the mesa going to a deep clear blue that hurt to look at. The cattle work settled into its winter rhythm. Raphael taught Nelson a roping technique that improved his speed considerably, and appeared to find Nelson's gratitude mildly amusing. Dub told a story about a winter in Wyoming that may or may not have involved a bear, and no one could conclusively determine whether it was true or not, but it was entertaining either way. Alma learned the full extent of what Nelson was with horses. He had not talked about it because it did not seem worth talking about, but she observed him one morning working with a young horse that Holly's had been struggling with for 2 months, a 4-year-old bay with a history of bad handling that had made him nervous and unpredictable. Nelson spent 3 hours with that horse, patient and quiet and entirely unhurried, and by the end of it the horse was following him around the corral like a dog. Alma sat on the fence and watched the whole thing. When it was done, Nelson looked up and found her there. "How long have you been able to do that?" she asked. "Always," he said. "My father said horses understood that I didn't want anything from them, that I was just present." "That's true of you with people too," she said. "You're present. Most people are always somewhere else, thinking about what comes next. You're actually here." It was a simple observation, and it moved him in a way that simple truths sometimes do, arriving at something he had not been able to articulate about himself. "I didn't used to be," he said. "I used to be somewhere else a lot, thinking about the next place, the next job." He looked at the horse, who was regarding him with the soft-eyed trust of an animal that has just decided it is safe. "I don't do that here." She came down from the fence and stood beside him, and the bay horse stretched his neck out and lipped gently at the brim of her hat, which made her laugh, a real laugh, unreserved and warm, and Nelson watched her laugh and felt something in his chest that was too large and comfortable to be anything other than what it was. Love. Simple and complete and absolutely without question. He told her so that evening. They were on the porch in the cold evening air, wrapped in blankets because neither of them was ready to go inside and end the conversation, which had ranged through a dozen topics over 2 hours and had the quality of all their best conversations, which was that it felt like exploring country you did not want to reach the end of. "I love you," he said, and it came out simply without preparation or dramatic setup, which was the right way for it to come out. She turned to look at him. Her face in the lamplight from the window was the face he wanted to see for the rest of his life, and he knew it with the absolute geological certainty of someone who has spent long enough moving to know precisely and immediately when he has found the thing that stops the movement. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to say it before you did because I didn't want to." She made a small gesture. "Overwhelm me," he said. "Scare you," she said. "Alma," he said, "you have never once frightened me." He paused. "You have awed me repeatedly, but not frightened me." She reached over and took his hand under the blanket and held it. "Stay," she said. "Not just for the season, stay." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I've been not going anywhere since October. I'm just becoming more official about it." She smiled, and the smile was the smile she gave when something had genuinely surprised her into pleasure, which was different from her polite smile and different from her amused smile and was his favorite of all her expressions. "More official how?" she asked. "However you want," he said. "I don't have a ring. I have a horse and a good reputation as a cattleman and an honest nature. If those are enough, then I'd like to ask you to marry me. If they're not enough yet, I'll work until they are." She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "Those are more than enough." A pause. "I have a ranch and a legal dispute in progress and a complicated family situation. If those are not too much, then yes. I would like to marry you, Nelson Blackwell." "Not too much," he said. "Not even close." He kissed her then on the cold porch with the stars very bright above the mesa, and it was a proper kiss, warm and certain and entirely itself. They were married in the Harlan Creek church with the cracked bell in April of 1887, which rang imperfectly and beautifully over the gathered town, that came out for the occasion with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a small community that has been watching a good story develop over several months, and is pleased to see it arrive at the right destination. Edna Greer from the general store cried, which she had predicted she would not do, and which everyone else had predicted she would. Holly stood up with Nelson, which was not traditional but suited both of them, and one of Alma's old school friends from the county seat came up for the occasion, and filled the church with the particular bright energy of someone who has been saying "I told you so" about love for 20 years, and is finally being proven right in the most satisfying possible way. Alma wore a dress she had made herself of ivory wool with small pearl buttons down the front, and she wore her hair down for the first time Nelson had seen it, dark and warm and loose around her shoulders, and when she came down the aisle with the morning light behind her, he thought he might simply stop breathing out of sheer excess of feeling, and had to make a conscious decision to keep doing it. He said his vows with the steady certainty of a man who has made few serious promises in his life, precisely because he understood that a serious promise must be kept. And when Alma said hers, she looked at him with the direct, warm gaze he had been looking for every morning since October, and he understood that this was the person he had been moving toward all those years without knowing it, and that the movement was now, finally, and completely, over. Douglas Bishop attended the wedding. He sat in the back pew and said nothing to anyone and left before the reception. Nelson noticed and decided to take it as the closest thing to acknowledgement that Douglas Bishop was capable of producing, and let it go at that. Garrett Finch did not attend the wedding. He sent a letter that said he hoped they would be very happy, and that he expected the $20 had been a worthwhile investment on somebody's part, which was, Nelson acknowledged, the most Garrett could be expected to manage in the way of graciousness. The reception was in the yard of the Bishop Ranch, where Alma's mother's lilac bushes stood dormant along the fence in the April light, waiting for May, and the tables were covered with food that various women of Harlan Creek had contributed with the competitive generosity of a community that takes its celebrations seriously, and there was fiddle music and dancing, and the easy warmth of people who live close enough to each other that a good day is genuinely shared. Hollies danced once, stiffly but gamely, with Edna Greer from the general store. Raphael danced 3 times with Alma's school friend from the county seat, and appeared to be in the process of forming his own opinions about the region. Dub told a story about a wedding he had attended in Colorado that somehow involved a runaway mule, and which may or may not have been true, but which kept a table of 8 people laughing for 20 minutes. And Nelson and Alma danced together as the evening came down over the mesa, the fiddle playing something slow and sweet, and she had her head against his shoulder and her hand in his, and the ranch around them was alive with light and sound, and the particular warmth of a thing rightly begun. "We did something unlikely," she said against his shoulder. "We did," he agreed. "It started with you being paid to lie to me," she said. "It started with me deciding not to," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him. "No," she said. "It started with me asking you directly and you not lying," she considered. "That was the beginning." "All right," he said. "That was the beginning." They danced until the fiddle player needed a rest, and then they sat together at the edge of the celebration and watched their friends and neighbors in the lantern light. And the night was full of warmth and the smell of good food and the sound of people being happy. And Nelson thought about 12 years of moving, and none of it wasted if it had brought him here, to this yard, to this woman, to this beginning that felt, for the first time in his life, like an arrival. August brought Alma's 27th birthday and the formal legal transfer of the Bishop Ranch, and Alma stood in Mr. Ames's office in the county seat with Nelson beside her, and signed her name to the document that made what had always morally been true legally true as well. The ranch was hers, completely and without condition, the property her father had built from nothing, and entrusted to her not out of sentiment, but out of the clear-eyed conviction that she was the right person to carry it forward. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily in public. But in the buggy on the way home, with the late summer hills rolling past and Nelson driving with the easy competence he brought to everything, she was very quiet for a long time, and when he glanced over at her, he saw that her eyes were bright. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the road unspooled ahead of them toward home. He would have been happy today, she said, meaning her father. He would have been proud, Nelson said. Not just today, consistently. She nodded once and did not speak again for a while, and the silence was the particular silence of someone letting something settle deeply into themselves, the way good rain settles into ground that has been waiting for it. They came home to the ranch in the long afternoon light, and Hollies and Raphael and Dub and Pete, and the 2 new hands they had taken on for the summer were all there. And there was a kind of quiet knowing among them that something significant had occurred, and someone had got hold of a bottle of good whiskey, and there were toasts made with the imprecise but genuine warmth of working men who do not often mark occasions but know when one deserves to be marked. Nelson stood with Alma in their yard and raised his glass to the sky, to Robert Bishop, who had built something worth fighting for, and to his daughter, who had fought for it and won. The ranch work continued and expanded through the following year. Nelson brought everything he had learned in 12 years of working other people's land to bear on land that he now understood as his home, and the combination of his practical knowledge and Alma's intimate understanding of the specific terrain and the specific cattle produced results that Hollies watched with professional satisfaction. They cleared a section of the north pasture that had been underutilized and ran a smaller but well-selected herd of breeding stock that Alma had been planning for years, the kind of long-term investment in quality that her father had always intended and that Douglas's short-term thinking had prevented. They renegotiated the terms of the remaining debt that the estate had carried, with Mr. Ames's help, and paid down a substantial portion of it by the following spring. Douglas Bishop left Harlan Creek in the winter of 1887, quietly and without announcement, bound for somewhere he had people who didn't know his history as well as the people here did. Nelson saw him go from the window of the general store where he was buying flour and did not feel the need to speak to him. They had said what there was to say. Some situations resolved themselves not dramatically, but simply by exhausting the energy that maintained them, and this was one of those. In February of 1888, Nelson was repairing the porch steps. They had needed it since before he arrived, and he had been working down a list of such maintenance with quiet satisfaction all winter, when Alma came to the door and stood there looking at him with an expression that was different from her usual expressions in a way he could not immediately classify. "Nelson," she said. He looked up. "I went to see Dr. Hatch this morning," she said. He set down his tools. He looked at her face and read it the way he read weather and ground and the slow, reliable movements of things, and what he read in her face was careful hope and something very large being held very quietly. "And," he said, "and we are going to have a child," she said. "In July, he thinks." He stood up from the porch steps. He crossed to where she stood in the doorway and he put his hands on her face, gently, as if she were something he was afraid to break, which she was not, and they both knew it. But the impulse was right regardless, and she looked back at him with those direct, warm eyes, and the careful hope in them had opened into something larger and more vulnerable. "July," he said. "July," she confirmed. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then her forehead again because he could not seem to decide, and she laughed at him, the real unguarded laugh that he loved. And he held her in the doorway of their house with the cold February wind coming across the mesa, and thought about what his father had said once. When the drought had taken the harvest and they had nothing, that land does not owe you abundance. But if you tend it with patience and honesty, it will give you what it can. He was beginning to think that principle extended to life more broadly. Their son was born on a hot July evening in 1888, delivered by Dr. Hatch with Alma's school friend in attendance as company and support, because that is the kind of woman Clara Hennessy was, the sort who appeared when she was needed, and was genuinely useful rather than merely decorative. Nelson spent the hours of the labor in the yard with Hollies and Raphael, who communicated their solidarity through the medium of tobacco and intermittent conversation about cattle, which was the right approach for the occasion. Dr. Hatch came out to the porch at 9 in the evening and said, "You have a healthy son, Mr. Blackwell," and Nelson sat down on the porch steps because his legs were apparently not willing to hold him at that particular moment, and Hollies put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, which was the right thing. They named him Robert for Alma's father. Robert James Blackwell, James for Nelson's father, who had worked hard ground with honest hands and given his son, if nothing else, the knowledge of what integrity looked like in practice. Nelson held his son for the first time in the lamplit room where Alma lay propped against pillows, exhausted and certain and radiantly herself, and the child was small and red and complete, with Alma's dark eyebrows and Nelson's gray eyes, and looked at the world with the focused attention of someone already taking inventory. "Hello," Nelson said to him, quietly, because the room was full of its own significance and loud things would have been wrong. The baby made a sound. "He agrees," Alma said, and she was smiling the particular smile, the real one, the one Nelson had been collecting since October of 1886. By the winter of 1888, the Bishop Ranch, the Blackwell Ranch now, though Alma kept her father's name on the operation and always would, because it was his name that the land had been built under, and his name deserved to stay with it, was running at a modest but genuine profit. The breeding herd was producing well. Nelson had expanded the horse operation, quietly and without fanfare, bringing in 2 mares of good bloodlines, and building relationships with buyers in the county and beyond who were willing to pay reasonable prices for well-trained horses. Hollies had stayed on, which was good, and Pete had found a girl in town and was planning to marry in the spring, which was good too, and Raphael had ridden to the county seat to call on Alma's friend Clara Hennessy with a frequency that suggested that situation was developing along predictable and pleasant lines. Dub told a story about a Christmas in Wyoming that was probably at least 1/3 true and involved, improbably, a lost elk and a Methodist hymnal, and it became one of those stories that people in Harlan Creek told for years afterward, attributed to various tellers, embellished slightly differently each time, which is the fate and the success of a good story. In the spring of 1889, a letter came from a cattle operation in New Mexico asking if Nelson Blackwell might be available to consult on building a horse training program, as his reputation in that area had traveled, which was both flattering and a measure of how completely his life had changed from the life of a man who moved from place to place with nothing to his name but his horse and his skill, and his unquiet desire for something he could not name. He showed the letter to Alma. She read it and handed it back and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to write back and tell them I'm not available," he said. "There might be good money in it," she said, in the tone of someone who is genuinely assessing rather than pushing. "There is good money in it," he agreed, "and I am not interested in leaving here to get it." He folded the letter. "We have what we need. We have more than we need. What I want is here." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Write back and tell them you'll send some recommendations. You know men who can do the work. Send them somewhere useful." He did exactly that, and the men he recommended did good work, and the New Mexico operation wrote back with thanks. And that was the end of the only serious pull he felt toward his old life, which was not really a pull toward his old life at all, but only the inertia of a habit that had already been broken. Robert James Blackwell learned to walk in August of 1889. In the yard of the ranch his great-grandfather had planted, and his grandmother had built, and his mother had fought for, and his father had found his way to buy a route that was crooked and dishonest at the beginning and entirely honest thereafter. He walked across the yard toward the horses with the unsteady certainty of a 14-month-old who has decided that walking is preferable to crawling and is not interested in feedback on this decision, and Alma caught him before he reached the corral fence, and he protested this interference with the full-throated conviction of a person who has opinions. "He is very determined," Nelson observed. "He is my son," Alma said, as if this explained everything, which it did. Nelson and Alma sat on the porch that evening as the sun went down over the mesa, which they still did most evenings when the weather permitted, a habit that had begun in the early months of their knowing each other, and that had continued through everything that followed, and that showed no sign of stopping. Robert was asleep inside, watched over by the competent eye of a woman from town who helped with the baby 3 afternoons a week, and who had strong opinions about everything that she delivered with entertaining frequency. The land was in its golden September hour, the grass gone amber and the cottonwoods along the creek beginning to yellow, and the cattle in the far pasture were moving in their slow evening drift, and the sky above the mesa was the particular deep blue of a season turning. 3 years ago this month, Alma said. "Almost exactly," he said. "You rode in with $20 and bad intentions," she said. "One bad intention," he said, "that I gave up almost immediately." "You told me before the first week was out," she said. "That is almost immediately." She was smiling. "I couldn't help it," he said. "You would have seen through it anyway." "I would have," she agreed without false modesty, because she had seen through it before he told her and they both knew it. "I'm glad I told you," he said. "I'm glad it was the first honest thing I did here, because everything after it, everything we built, it's all standing on that." He paused. "On the truth. On you asking me directly and me not lying." She turned to look at him, and the evening light was on her face, and she was 30 years old, and every year of it showed not as diminishment, but as the accumulation of someone who had been fully alive in each of those years, and he loved her with the steady, geological, absolute certainty that he had loved her since he had first understood what he was feeling, which was before the first week was out, which was before the pretending had even properly begun. "We built something good," she said. "We did," he said. "Father's ranch," she said. "Our home. Our children's inheritance," he said. She reached over and took his hand, which was warm and calloused and entirely his and entirely hers, and they sat on the porch of the ranch that Robert Bishop had built from nothing, and that his daughter had fought to keep, and that Nelson Blackwell had arrived at by the most improbable and dishonest route imaginable, and had subsequently loved with everything honest in him. And the evening deepened around them, and the stars came out above the mesa one by one, and the land was quiet and good and entirely theirs. In May of 1891, Alma gave Nelson a second son, whom they named James Robert, for both grandfathers in reversed order, a compromise that satisfied the historical record and was arrived at after a good-natured 3-day negotiation that Nelson maintained he won on merit, and Alma maintained she permitted because she was feeling generous, and both of them were right in their way. James was loud and sociable and interested in everything immediately, where Robert had been focused and serious and took his time with new information. Robert learned to read early and sat in corners with books with the absorbed quality of someone who has found something deeply congenial and intends to do a great deal of it. James learned to walk early and immediately went to find as many people as possible to show the accomplishment to. Nelson watched his sons grow with the particular steady wonder of a man who had spent too long in empty country and found, in the fullness of his life, that the richness of it still had the power to astonish him when he stopped long enough to look directly at it. Hollis retired in 1892 at the age of 61, with the mild reluctance of a man who has worked hard all his life and is not entirely sure what to do with the absence of that work, but who agreed, after some negotiation, to stay on in an advisory capacity that meant he could tell the new foreman, a capable young man named Torres whom Alma had been cultivating for the role for 2 years, what he was doing wrong and occasionally demonstrate the right way without getting on a horse at 4 in the morning to do it. Torres took the guidance well because he was smart enough to know what he did not yet know, which is the most important quality in anyone who is learning something difficult. The Copper Spur Saloon got a new owner in 1893 who changed the name and added a second room and generally improved the establishment's reputation, which had been mixed under the previous owner. The crack in the church bell was eventually attended to by a traveling craftsman in the spring of 1894, who said it could be repaired well enough to ring clean, and on the Sunday after the repair, the bell rang clear and whole over Harlan Creek, and people came out of their houses to hear it, because a clear bell is a small thing and also not a small thing, and the town stood in the bright spring morning and listened to it and were pleased. Raphael Morales married Clara Hennessy in the fall of 1890, after a courtship that was conducted with more decorum than speed, and that Alma observed with great satisfaction, because she had predicted it approximately 14 months before it happened, and Nelson had agreed with her prediction about 12 months before it happened, and only Dub had initially been skeptical, and Dub admitted at the reception, with the good grace of a man whose story might be improved by the admission, that he had been wrong. The Morales family settled in Harlan Creek, and Raphael brought his considerable skills to the Bishop Ranch operation, and his children and the Blackwell children grew up together in the way that children in small western towns did, free and wild and safe, within the watchful periphery of the community that raised them. Nelson rode the fence lines most mornings, not because they still needed constant attention. The fencing was solid now, properly set and well maintained, but because the fence line took him across all 4 corners of the land, and he had come to need that morning circuit the way some men need coffee, not for the caffeine but for the ritual. The land looked different every morning. The light changed, the season changed, the grass changed. The mesa was different in October than in April. The creek ran different in March than in August. There was always something new in country you paid close attention to, and Nelson had learned in the only school that really teaches such things to pay close attention. Alma was at the table when he came in from those morning rides, with coffee and whatever the morning had produced in the way of decisions and letters, and the ongoing management of a working cattle ranch in the 1890s, and he would come in smelling of horse and early morning, and she would look up at him over whatever she was reading with the look she had. The warm, direct look that was the same look she had had when she first said his name as if it meant something. And he would pour his coffee and sit across from her, and they would begin the day together. It was not dramatic. It was not the stuff of dime novels or illustrated magazine stories about the frontier. It was specific and real and daily, and full of the particular textures of a life that has been chosen deliberately and maintained with care. The fence lines and the cattle and the boys growing up loud and smart and interested in everything, and the evening porch with the mesa going purple in the distance, and the bedroom where they talked in the dark about everything that the day had been too full to hold, and the winters that were cold and close, and the springs that were mud and new grass, and the lilac bushes in May that bloomed for Alma's mother every year, reliably and without fail. In the summer of 1895, Robert Bishop Blackwell, who was 7 years old and had been reading everything he could get his hands on for 3 years, found a copy of a dime novel in the general store featuring a cowboy hero of improbable courage and questionable grammar, and brought it home and read it in approximately 4 hours, and then presented himself before his father with the air of someone who has a significant question. "Is this what it was like," he asked, "when you came here?" Nelson looked at the dime novel cover, which featured a man on a rearing horse against an improbable sunset. "Not quite," he said. "Were there outlaws?" "There were people who did dishonest things," Nelson said carefully. "Some of them for money and some of them out of fear and some of them just out of habit." "Did you fight them?" "I told the truth," Nelson said. "Sometimes that's the harder fight." Robert considered this with the focused seriousness he brought to everything. "The book says the cowboy always wins by being the fastest shot," he said. "That's one kind of story," Nelson said. "There are others. What kind is yours?" Nelson looked at his son, who had his mother's dark eyes and his grandfather's serious brow, and who was going to grow up to be someone interesting and substantial. He could see it already with complete clarity. "Mine is the kind," he said, "where a man rides into town with bad intentions and tells the truth instead, and everything good in his life comes from that one moment of deciding to be honest." Robert thought about this. "That's not a very exciting beginning," he said. "No," Nelson agreed, "but the middle is very good, and the ending is the best part." He looked up from his son's upturned face to find Alma standing in the kitchen doorway, having heard enough to know what was being said, and she was smiling the smile, the real one, the unguarded one, and he smiled back at her across the room and across the years and across the particular distance of who they had each been before they found each other, which was not so far in the end as it had seemed at the time. Robert went outside to argue with his brother about something, with the energy of two boys who have a great deal of afternoon ahead of them, and the ranch was loud for a moment with the sound of children, and then settled back into its working quiet. And Alma came across the kitchen and sat down beside Nelson at the table and put her hand over his the way she had since the very beginning of the real thing. The evening in the barn when she had told him to stop pretending and he had never pretended again. "He asked about your story," she said. "He did," Nelson said. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Nelson said. "The short version. The long version would take years." "We have years," she said. "We do," he said, "all of them." Outside, the mesa stood against the sky the way it had stood for 1,000 years and would stand for 1,000 more, indifferent and magnificent. And the cattle moved in the autumn pasture, and the horses moved in the near corral, and the cottonwoods along the creek were going gold in the September light. And the Bishop Ranch, the Blackwell home, sat solid and warm and real on the best piece of that land, the way it had since Robert Bishop had come west with $40 and a conviction that honest work on honest ground would give a person something worth passing on. It had given him a daughter worth the whole of it. And the daughter had given herself a life worth all of it, which she had built on the simple foundation of asking a man a direct question and accepting the truth when he gave it to her. And the man had given himself everything he had ever needed by deciding, before the first week was even out, to stop pretending. It turned out that was all it had taken. That, and the courage to stay.